On a humid summer evening in July 1990, the small town of Dawsonville, Georgia, was settling into the comfortable rhythm of a Friday night. Families gathered on front porches to escape the heat. The Dairy Queen on Main Street was filled with teenagers celebrating the start of summer vacation. Street lights flickered on one by one along Highway 53, casting long shadows across the storefronts that had stood unchanged for decades. This was a town where everyone knew everyone, where doors stayed unlocked, where secrets were supposed to be impossible to keep. But in a place like Dawsonville, population barely 4,000, some secrets don't hide in darkness. They hide in plain sight. At 30 years old, Jennifer Clarkson had lived her entire life within a 10-mile radius of where she was born. She worked the evening shift at the Dawson County Hospital, a modest facility on the edge of town where she'd been employed as a nurse's aide for nearly 8 years. Her co-workers described her as reliable, kind, someone who remembered birthdays and always volunteered for the least desirable shifts during holidays so mothers with young children could stay home. She lived alone in a small rental house on Perimeter Road, a quiet street lined with modest homes and overgrown magnolia trees. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't famous. She was simply Jennifer, a familiar face in a town full of familiar faces. That Friday night, Jennifer finished her shift at 11 o'clock. She clocked out, waved goodbye to the overnight staff, and walked to her car in the employee parking lot. The air was thick and still. Crickets sang from the tree line beyond the lot. Her white Toyota Corolla sat beneath a flickering parking lot light, one of only 3 vehicles left at that hour. She never made it home. Before we continue with this shocking story, take a second to hit subscribe and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We'd love to know how far these stories reach. This channel brings you true crime stories from small American towns, cases that deserve to be remembered, voices that deserve to be heard. Stories like Jennifer's. The next morning, when Jennifer didn't show up for her regular Saturday lunch with her mother, alarm bells started ringing. Margaret Clarkson had spoken to her daughter every single day for 30 years. Missing lunch without a phone call wasn't like Jennifer. Missing lunch and not answering her phone was unthinkable. By Saturday afternoon, Margaret stood on the front porch of Jennifer's rental house, knocking on a door that wouldn't open. The curtains were drawn. Jennifer's car wasn't in the driveway. The mailbox was empty. Everything looked normal, but nothing felt right. A mother knows. Margaret drove to the Dawson County Sheriff's Office and filed a missing person report before the sun went down. The investigation began immediately, but in a way that would haunt everyone involved for decades to come. In 1990, missing adult cases didn't trigger the same urgency as missing children. Jennifer was 30, employed, independent. The initial assumption among some deputies was that she'd left town voluntarily, maybe to escape the small-town monotony, maybe to start over somewhere new. But anyone who knew Jennifer understood how absurd that theory was. She didn't want to escape Dawsonville. She loved it. Her entire life was built there. By Sunday, search parties formed. Volunteers combed the woods along Highway 53. Divers checked the Etowah River. Flyers with Jennifer's photograph appeared on every telephone pole, every storefront window, every bulletin board in Dawson County. The image showed a woman with shoulder-length brown hair, warm eyes, and a slight smile that suggested she'd been laughing just before the picture was taken. Beneath the photo, in bold letters, missing. Jennifer Lynn Clarkson. Last seen July 20, 1990. The town held its breath. On Monday morning, a fisherman named Robert Hayes was walking along a dirt access road near Amicalola Falls State Park, about 12 miles northeast of Dawsonville. He was heading toward a favorite fishing spot he'd visited dozens of times before. The morning was already warm, the air heavy with moisture. As he rounded a bend in the trail, he saw something that didn't belong. A white Toyota Corolla, parked awkwardly off the shoulder of the access road, partially obscured by low-hanging branches. Hayes approached carefully. The car's windows were up. The doors were locked. He peered inside and saw nothing unusual at first, just an empty interior, a hospital parking permit hanging from the rearview mirror. Then he noticed the keys. They were still in the ignition. He called the sheriff's office from the park ranger station. Within an hour, deputies arrived. They ran the plates. The car belonged to Jennifer Clarkson. But Jennifer was nowhere to be found. The discovery of the abandoned vehicle shifted everything. This was no longer a woman who'd left town on her own terms. This was something darker. Investigators processed the scene with the resources available to a small county sheriff's office in 1990. They dusted for fingerprints. They photographed the interior. They searched the surrounding woods with dogs and deputies walking shoulder to shoulder through dense underbrush. The car itself told a strange story. There were no signs of struggle inside. No blood. No torn upholstery. Nothing broken. The keys in the ignition suggested Jennifer had either been interrupted while parking or forced to leave the vehicle in a hurry. But forced by whom? And why? The location troubled investigators. Amicalola Falls was a popular spot for locals and tourists, but the access road where the car was found was rarely used, known mostly to fishermen and experienced hikers. It wasn't a place Jennifer had any known connection to. She wasn't an outdoors enthusiast. She didn't fish. She didn't hike. So why would her car be there? Days became weeks. Investigators interviewed everyone who'd seen Jennifer that Friday night. Her co-workers at the hospital all told the same story. She'd seemed normal, maybe a little tired, but nothing unusual. She'd finished her rounds, completed her paperwork, and left at her regular time. No one saw her talking to anyone suspicious. No one noticed anyone following her. The parking lot security camera, the one camera that might have captured something useful, had been broken for 3 months. Budget cuts had delayed the repair. Detectives canvassed the area around Amicalola Falls. Had anyone seen the white Corolla being driven there? Had anyone noticed a woman matching Jennifer's description? The answers were always the same. No. Nothing. No one. The investigation expanded. Police looked into Jennifer's personal life with the uncomfortable thoroughness that missing person cases demand. They spoke to her ex-husband, a man she'd divorced 5 years earlier after a brief, troubled marriage. He had an alibi. He'd been in Atlanta that weekend, verified by multiple witnesses. They spoke to her small circle of friends. They reviewed her finances, her phone records, her mail. Everything pointed to a woman living a quiet, unremarkable life. No debts. No enemies. No secret relationships. No reason for anyone to want her gone. Margaret Clarkson became a fixture at the sheriff's office. She came every day, asking the same questions. Have you found anything? Are you still looking? Do you believe she's alive? The deputies tried to be kind, but the truth was, they were running out of leads. The case was stalling. In small towns, rumors fill the spaces where facts should be. People whispered that Jennifer had been having an affair with a married man. Others suggested she'd gotten involved with drugs, though there was no evidence of that. Some believed she'd simply run away, staged the whole thing, and was living under a new name somewhere far from Georgia. The rumors hurt Margaret more than the silence. By autumn, the active search had stopped. The case remained open, but the day-to-day urgency faded. Detectives still followed tips when they came in, but tips were becoming rare. The story slipped from the front page of the Dawson County News to the back pages, then disappeared entirely. Jennifer's rental house sat empty for months before the landlord finally cleared it out. Margaret took her daughter's belongings, boxing up clothes and photographs and keepsakes, storing them in her own attic because she refused to believe Jennifer was never coming back. The years passed slowly in Dawsonville. In 1992, a hiker found a human bone in the woods about 5 miles from where Jennifer's car had been discovered. For 3 agonizing weeks, Margaret waited while forensic analysts ran tests. The bone belonged to a man who'd been dead for over a decade. Not Jennifer. In 1995, a woman matching Jennifer's description was spotted at a truck stop in Tennessee. Investigators followed the lead. It went nowhere. In 1998, the Dawson County Sheriff's Office underwent a change in leadership. The new sheriff, a man named Thomas Wade, inherited dozens of cold cases, including Jennifer's. He assigned a young detective named Carol Winters to review the files. Winters spent weeks reading through witness statements, evidence logs, and investigative reports. She found a case that had been thoroughly worked but had simply run out of momentum. The physical evidence was minimal. The witness statements were consistent but unhelpful. The timeline made sense right up until the moment Jennifer's car appeared 12 miles from the hospital, and then everything stopped making sense. Winters kept the file on her desk. She made it a habit to pull it out every few months, reading through it again, hoping something new would jump out. Nothing ever did. By the year 2000, a decade had passed since Jennifer disappeared. Margaret Clarkson was 63 years old, her hair gone completely gray, her face etched with lines that hadn't been there before. She still called the sheriff's office every few months, still asked if there was any news. The answer was always the same. The town had moved on. New families moved into Dawsonville. Old families moved away. The hospital where Jennifer worked underwent renovations. The Dairy Queen closed and reopened under new management. Life continued, the way it always does, even when one life is frozen in time. But in a town where everyone knows everyone, some people carry weight that others can't see. Detective Carol Winters never stopped thinking about Jennifer Clarkson. By 2005, Winters had been promoted to lead investigator for the Dawson County Sheriff's Office. She'd solved cases that seemed impossible, earned a reputation for persistence, for refusing to let go. But Jennifer's case gnawed at her in a way others didn't. 15 years had passed. 15 years of silence. Winters began to approach the case differently. She stopped looking for new evidence and started looking at old evidence with new eyes. She pulled every file, every photograph, every witness statement that had been collected in 1990 and spread them across the conference room table. She wasn't looking for what had been missed. She was looking for what had been misunderstood. One detail kept surfacing in the reports. Multiple witnesses mentioned seeing Jennifer talking to someone in the hospital parking lot the week before she disappeared. The conversations had seemed casual, friendly even, nothing alarming. But no one had been able to identify who the person was. The descriptions were vague. A man, maybe average height, maybe wearing a dark shirt. The kind of description that fits 1,000 people. Winters started re-interviewing people who'd worked at the hospital in 1990. Most had moved on, retired, relocated. Tracking them down took months. When she finally reached them, their memories were faded, softened by time. They remembered Jennifer fondly but couldn't add anything new. Except one person. Linda Marsh had worked as a nurse at Dawson County Hospital for 35 years. She'd been there the night Jennifer disappeared, finishing up the evening shift just an hour before Jennifer clocked out. In 2006, when Winters sat down with her in a quiet coffee shop in Dahlonega, Linda was 71 years old and recently retired. Winters asked the same questions that had been asked 16 years earlier. Had Linda noticed anything unusual that night? Had Jennifer seemed upset or distracted? Had anyone been hanging around the parking lot? Linda's answers were the same as they'd been in 1990. No, nothing unusual. Jennifer had seemed fine. The parking lot had been quiet. But then, unprompted, Linda added something. You know, she said, stirring her coffee slowly, I always wondered about Dennis. Winters leaned forward. Dennis? Dennis Pritchard. He worked maintenance at the hospital back then. Nice enough guy, I guess. Quiet. Kept to himself mostly. Winters wrote down the name. Dennis Pritchard. It didn't appear anywhere in the case file. Why did you wonder about him? Winters asked. Linda hesitated, choosing her words carefully. He had a thing for Jennifer. Everyone knew it. He'd find excuses to be wherever she was working. Fixing a light in the hallway, adjusting a thermostat, that kind of thing. Jennifer was polite to him, the way she was polite to everyone, but she wasn't interested. He didn't seem to understand that. Did he ever do anything inappropriate? Not that I saw. But after Jennifer went missing, Dennis stopped coming to work. Just didn't show up one day. We heard he'd quit, moved away. At the time, I thought it was strange, but I didn't think it meant anything. Winters felt something shift. Do you remember exactly when he left? Linda thought for a moment. Maybe a week after Jennifer disappeared? Maybe 2. It was right around then. This was new. This was something. Winters returned to the office and started digging into Dennis Pritchard's background. She found employment records confirming he'd worked at the hospital from 1987 until late July 1990. He'd given no notice, simply stopped showing up. No forwarding address had been left with the hospital administration. She ran his name through state databases. Dennis Pritchard had left Georgia entirely. She found a driver's license issued in North Carolina in 1991, then another in Tennessee in 1995, then South Carolina in 2001. He'd moved around, never staying in one place for long. By 2007, Winters had located him. Dennis Pritchard was living in a small apartment in Greenville, South Carolina, working as a custodian for a public school. He was 52 years old, unmarried, no criminal record. Winters drove to South Carolina with another detective. They knocked on Pritchard's door on a cool afternoon in October. The man who answered looked tired, older than 52, with thinning hair and the kind of face that seemed designed to be forgettable. When Winters identified herself and asked if they could talk about Jennifer Clarkson, his expression didn't change. "I figured someone would come eventually," he said quietly. They sat in Dennis Pritchard's apartment, a sparse space with minimal furniture and nothing on the walls. Winters asked if he remembered Jennifer. He said yes, of course. She asked why he'd left Georgia so suddenly in 1990. Pritchard looked at his hands. "I left because I was scared." "Scared of what?" "Scared people would think I had something to do with what happened to her." "Did you?" He met her eyes then, and Winters saw something she couldn't quite read. "I didn't hurt Jennifer. I swear to God, I didn't." "But you know something." Pritchard was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I saw her that night. The night she disappeared." Winters kept her expression neutral, but her pulse quickened. "Where did you see her?" "At the hospital. I was finishing up some work in the basement. I came upstairs just as she was leaving. It was late, maybe a little after 11. She walked to her car, and I watched her from the doorway. I didn't approach her or anything. I watched." "Was anyone else there?" "There was another car in the parking lot. A truck, actually. Dark blue, maybe black. I remember because it was parked near hers, and I thought it was odd since the lot was mostly empty." "Did you see who was in the truck?" Pritchard nodded slowly. "A man got out as Jennifer reached her car. They talked for a minute. I was too far away to hear what they were saying." "Did you recognize him?" "I'd seen him around town. I didn't know his name, but I knew who he was. Everyone knew who he was." Winters waited. "He was a deputy," Pritchard said. "With the sheriff's office." The words hung in the air. Winters asked Pritchard to describe the man. "Average height, stocky build, dark hair." Pritchard remembered he was wearing civilian clothes, not a uniform. He remembered the way the man stood close to Jennifer, the way she seemed to step back, the way the conversation looked tense. "What happened next?" Winters asked. "They talked for maybe 2 minutes. Then Jennifer got in her car and left. The deputy got back in his truck and followed her. He followed her? Yeah. He pulled out right after she did, heading in the same direction. And you didn't report this? Pritchard's face flushed. I thought about it. I almost did. But then I heard they'd found her car, and I heard the sheriff's office was investigating, and I panicked. If I said I saw one of their own following her, would they even believe me? Or would they turn it around, make me the suspect? I was a nobody, just a maintenance guy. He was law enforcement. So I ran. I left Georgia and never came back. Winters asked him to come to the station, give a formal statement. Pritchard agreed without hesitation. He said he'd been carrying the weight of what he saw for 17 years, and he was ready to put it down. Back in Georgia, Winters pulled personnel records for every deputy who'd been employed by the Dawson County Sheriff's Office in 1990. She cross-referenced them with Pritchard's description. 3 men fit the basic profile, but only one matched perfectly. Michael Torrance. 48 years old in 1990, a 15-year veteran of the department. Stocky build, dark hair, well-liked by his colleagues. He'd been interviewed during the initial investigation, asked if he'd seen anything unusual around the time Jennifer disappeared. He'd said no. Michael Torrance had retired from the sheriff's office in 2003. He still lived in Dawsonville. Winters approached her superiors carefully. Accusing a former deputy, a man who'd served the community for decades, was not something to be done lightly. She presented Pritchard's statement, outlined the timeline, and requested permission to bring Torrance in for questioning. The sheriff at the time, a man who'd worked alongside Torrance for years, looked at Winters with something close to disbelief. Mike Torrance? You think Mike was involved? I think we need to ask him some questions, Winters said. In December 2007, Michael Torrance sat across from Winters in an interview room at the sheriff's office. He was 65 years old, gray-haired, still carrying himself with the quiet authority of a man used to being in control. Winters explained that new information had come to light regarding Jennifer Clarkson's disappearance. She asked if he remembered the case. Of course, Torrance said. We all remember it. Terrible thing. Do you remember where you were the night she disappeared? That was 17 years ago, Detective. I don't remember where I was last Tuesday. Winters laid out Pritchard's statement. Torrance's expression barely changed. Someone says they saw me talking to Jennifer Clarkson in the hospital parking lot? That's correct. Torrance shook his head slowly. That's not true. You weren't at the hospital that night? I may have been. I don't recall. But I didn't talk to Jennifer Clarkson. This witness says you followed her when she left. Then this witness is mistaken. Or lying. The interview went on for 2 hours. Torrance never wavered. He denied being at the hospital. He denied talking to Jennifer. He suggested Pritchard was confused or trying to deflect blame from himself. Winters had no physical evidence tying Torrance to the scene. She had one witness whose credibility would be questioned, a man who'd fled the state and stayed silent for nearly 2 decades. She had a retired deputy with a clean record and the respect of the entire law enforcement community in Dawson County. The case wasn't closed, but it wasn't moving forward either. What Detective Winters didn't know yet was that Michael Torrance had made a mistake 17 years earlier. A small mistake, the kind that seems insignificant at the time but grows heavier with every passing year. After Jennifer Clarkson disappeared, when the sheriff's office was processing her abandoned vehicle, one piece of evidence had been catalogued and filed away without much attention. A partial fingerprint, lifted from the exterior driver's side door handle. In 1990, fingerprint analysis was limited. Without a suspect to compare it to, the print sat in an evidence locker, one more piece of a puzzle no one could solve. In 2008, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation launched a cold case initiative, using updated technology to re-examine physical evidence from unsolved crimes. Dawson County submitted several cases, including Jennifer's. The partial fingerprint from her car door was scanned into a digital database and run through the state's automated fingerprint identification system, a technology that hadn't existed in 1990. The system found a match. The print belonged to Michael Torrance. When Winters received the results, she sat in her office for a long time, staring at the report. A partial print wasn't conclusive proof of anything by itself. Torrance could argue he'd touched the car while processing the scene, though the evidence log showed he hadn't been assigned to examine the vehicle. He could argue he'd encountered Jennifer at some point before her disappearance, though he'd already denied ever speaking to her. But combined with Pritchard's statement, the fingerprint shifted the case from speculation to something more solid. Winters needed more. She started pulling everything she could find on Torrance's life in 1990. Work schedules, shift logs, personal records. She discovered that in the weeks following Jennifer's disappearance, Torrance had requested a transfer to a different shift, moving from evenings to days. He'd cited personal reasons, and the request had been granted without question. She found something else. In August 1990, just weeks after Jennifer vanished, Torrance had sold his dark blue pickup truck, a vehicle he'd owned for 5 years. He'd bought a new car, a sedan, and paid cash. The timing felt significant. Winters tracked down the person who'd bought the truck. The man had owned it for 3 years before selling it again. He didn't remember anything unusual about it, but he still had the title paperwork. The truck had been a 1985 Chevrolet Silverado, dark blue. The description matched what Dennis Pritchard had seen. In 2009, Winters approached Torrance again. This time, she had the fingerprint evidence. She laid it out carefully, watching his face. "There's a fingerprint on Jennifer Clarkson's car," she said. "It matches yours." Torrance didn't blink. "I must have touched her car at some point. Maybe I walked past it in the hospital parking lot. You told me you didn't remember being at the hospital that night." "I said I might have been. I don't recall." "You also told me you never spoke to Jennifer." "But Dennis Pritchard says he saw you talking to her." "Dennis Pritchard is wrong." Winters leaned forward. "Michael, you sold your truck right after she disappeared." "Why?" "I don't remember. Maybe I needed a different vehicle." "You paid cash for the new car. Where did that money come from?" "Savings." "I don't know. It was 20 years ago." The conversation went in circles. Torrance gave explanations for everything. Plausible explanations. Not quite believable, but not provably false. Winters knew she was close, but close wasn't enough. Months passed. Winters continued working the case quietly, but she was running into walls. The fingerprint and the witness statement weren't enough to bring charges. The district attorney made that clear. Without a body, without more direct evidence, without something that conclusively tied Torrance to Jennifer's disappearance, the case couldn't move forward. And then, in late 2010, something unexpected happened. Michael Torrance's wife, a woman named Susan, filed for divorce. The filing cited irreconcilable differences and requested a division of marital assets. It was a routine legal action, the kind that happens every day. But divorces have a way of loosening secrets. Susan Torrance had been married to Michael for 38 years. She'd been a devoted wife, a Sunday school teacher, a woman known in Dawsonville for her kindness and her loyalty. When she filed for divorce in 2010, people were shocked. No one had seen it coming. Winters heard about the divorce through the small-town grapevine that connects everyone in places like Dawsonville. She debated whether to approach Susan, wondering if it would be crossing a line, if it would be seen as exploiting a woman's personal pain. In January 2011, Winters made the decision. She called Susan and asked if they could meet. They sat in Susan's attorney's office on a cold Thursday afternoon. Susan was 68 years old, thin and tired-looking, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She'd agreed to the meeting, but she seemed uncertain about what to say. Winters explained that she was investigating Jennifer Clarkson's disappearance. She said Michael's name had come up in connection with the case. She asked if Susan knew anything that might help. Susan was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I've prayed about this for 20 years. Winters waited. Michael changed after that girl disappeared, Susan continued, her voice barely steady. He became distant, angry. He started drinking more. He'd have nightmares, wake up in the middle of the night. I asked him what was wrong, and he'd say it was stress from work. But it wasn't work. I knew it wasn't work. Did he ever talk about Jennifer? Not to me. But one night, maybe a month after she went missing, I woke up and he wasn't in bed. I found him sitting in the garage, just sitting there in the dark. When I turned on the light, he looked at me like he didn't know who I was. And he said, 'I didn't mean for it to happen.'" Winters felt her breath catch. What didn't he mean to happen? I asked him that. He wouldn't answer. He just kept saying, "I didn't mean it." I asked if he was talking about Jennifer Clarkson, and he looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before. Fear, maybe. Or panic. He told me to go back to bed and never bring it up again. So I didn't. For 20 years, I didn't. Why are you telling me now? Susan's eyes filled with tears. Because I can't carry it anymore. Because that girl's mother deserves to know what happened to her daughter. Because living with a man who I think did something terrible has broken me, and I can't do it anymore. Winters asked if Susan would be willing to give a formal statement. Susan said yes. The statement was recorded, notarized, and added to the case file. It wasn't a confession, but it was close. It was a wife of nearly 4 decades saying her husband had all but admitted to involvement in a woman's disappearance. Armed with Susan's testimony, the fingerprint evidence, and Dennis Pritchard's eyewitness account, Winters presented the case to the district attorney again. This time, the DA agreed. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. In March 2011, Michael Torrance was arrested at his home and charged with the murder of Jennifer Clarkson. 21 years after she vanished, someone was finally being held accountable. The arrest sent shockwaves through Dawsonville. Torrance had been a pillar of the community, a man people trusted. Parents had felt safe knowing he was patrolling their streets. Business owners had welcomed him into their shops. The idea that he might have been responsible for Jennifer's death all along was almost too much to process. Margaret Clarkson, 74 years old by then, heard the news from Detective Winters in person. Winters drove to her house, sat with her in the living room where photographs of Jennifer still covered the mantel, and told her they'd made an arrest. Margaret didn't cry. She'd run out of tears years ago. She just nodded slowly and said, "I knew someone knew what happened. I always knew." The legal process moved slowly. Torrance pleaded not guilty. His attorney argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that Susan's statement was the bitter accusation of a woman in the midst of a painful divorce, that Dennis Pritchard's testimony was unreliable given his 17-year silence, that the fingerprint proved nothing more than incidental contact. But prosecutors built their case methodically. They presented the timeline. Jennifer was last seen leaving the hospital. Dennis Pritchard saw Torrance talking to her and following her when she left. Torrance's fingerprint was on her car. His own wife heard him say, "I didn't mean for it to happen," in the weeks after Jennifer disappeared. He'd sold his truck and moved to a different shift. He'd lied about being at the hospital that night. The trial began in the summer of 2013. The courtroom in Dawsonville was packed every day. People who remembered Jennifer came to watch. People who remembered Torrance came to see if it was true. Dennis Pritchard testified, his voice shaking as he described what he'd seen that night. He admitted he'd been a coward for not coming forward sooner. He said he'd regretted his silence every day for 23 years. Susan Torrance took the stand and repeated what she'd told Detective Winters. Her voice was steady, her face pale. When she was asked if she stood by her statement, she said, "Yes. I believe my husband killed Jennifer Clarkson." The defense called Torrance to testify. He denied everything. He said he'd never followed Jennifer. He said his wife was lying. He said Pritchard was mistaken or making things up for attention. He said the fingerprint meant nothing. But when the prosecutor asked him, "Why did you tell your wife you didn't mean for it to happen?" Torrance's face went blank. "I don't remember saying that," he said. "Your wife remembers. She's wrong. Is she lying? I don't know what she thinks she heard." The jury deliberated for 3 days. On August 14, 2013, they returned a verdict. Guilty. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Margaret Clarkson sat in the front row, her hands gripping the wooden bench in front of her. When she heard the word "guilty," she closed her eyes and let out a breath she'd been holding for 23 years. Michael Torrance showed no emotion. He stood as the judge addressed him, his face set in stone. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. The judge spoke directly to Torrance, asking if he had anything to say before the sentence was handed down. Torrance stood and looked at the judge. "I didn't kill Jennifer Clarkson," he said. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As Torrance was led out of the courtroom, reporters tried to ask him questions. He said nothing. He never said anything about Jennifer again. After the trial, Detective Carol Winters sat down with Margaret Clarkson in a quiet room at the back of the courthouse. Margaret wanted to know everything. What had happened that night? How had Jennifer died? Where was her body? Winters had to tell her the truth. They still didn't know. Torrance had never confessed to the specifics. They believed, based on the evidence, that he'd followed Jennifer after she left the hospital, possibly pulled her over under the guise of a traffic stop or some official police business. What happened after that was speculation. Maybe he'd been obsessed with her, maybe he'd been rejected one too many times, maybe something had gone wrong in a confrontation that was never supposed to turn violent. Jennifer's body had never been found. Despite extensive searches of the area around Amicalola Falls and beyond, there was no trace of her. Torrance had been trained in law enforcement. He knew how to cover his tracks. Margaret asked if they would keep looking. Winters promised they would. She promised Jennifer's case would never truly be closed until they brought her home. In the weeks after the trial, Susan Torrance left Dawsonville. She moved to Tennessee to be closer to her daughter. Before she left, she gave an interview to a local reporter. She said she'd stayed silent for 20 years because she'd been afraid, because she'd loved her husband, because she'd convinced herself she was wrong about what she'd heard that night in the garage. She said she hoped people would forgive her for not speaking sooner. The community's reaction was complicated. Some people understood. Some didn't. A few said she should have known, should have said something years ago. But most recognized that Susan had been a victim too, trapped in an impossible situation, married to a man who'd hidden something monstrous. Dennis Pritchard never returned to Georgia. He gave his testimony and went back to South Carolina. In an email to Detective Winters, he wrote, "I hope this helps someone. I hope Jennifer's mother can find some peace. I'm sorry I waited so long." The trial and conviction reopened conversations in Dawsonville about trust, about authority, about how easy it is for someone to hide in plain sight when they wear a badge. Parents who'd felt safe knowing Michael Torrance was patrolling their streets realized how fragile that safety had been. Detective Winters retired in 2015. She'd worked in law enforcement for 28 years, solved dozens of cases, but she said Jennifer Clarkson's case was the one that mattered most. Not because it was the hardest, but because it took the longest, because it required refusing to give up even when everyone else had moved on. In 2016, Margaret Clarkson passed away. She was 79 years old. Her obituary mentioned that she'd fought tirelessly for justice for her daughter and had lived to see that fight succeed. Friends said she'd found peace in the final years of her life, knowing Jennifer's case had been solved, even if Jennifer herself had never been found. To this day, searches continue periodically in the woods and waterways around Dawson County. Volunteers still gather on the anniversary of Jennifer's disappearance, walking through the same areas that were searched in 1990, hoping technology or luck or persistence will reveal what's been hidden for over 3 decades. Michael Torrance remains in prison. He's 72 years old now. He maintains his innocence. He's filed appeals, all of which have been denied. He's never told anyone where Jennifer's body is, if he even knows. The case of Jennifer Clarkson is technically solved, but it doesn't feel solved. Not completely. Not while she's still missing. The case of Jennifer Clarkson is technically solved, but it doesn't feel solved. Not completely. Not while she's still missing. The Dawson County Sheriff's Office keeps Jennifer's file in active storage, not archived with other cold cases from the 1990s. New detectives are briefed on it when they join the department. They're told this is the case that taught the county a hard lesson about trust, about looking closely at the people you think you know. In 2017, a documentary filmmaker reached out to the sheriff's office, asking permission to tell Jennifer's story. The request was denied. The department felt the case was still too raw, too personal for the community. Margaret was gone, and there was no one left to speak for Jennifer in the way her mother had. But Jennifer is still spoken about. At the Dawson County Hospital, where she worked for 8 years, there's a small plaque in the staff break room. It reads, "In memory of Jennifer Lynn Clarkson, 1960 to 1990. A dedicated caregiver and friend." New nurses ask about her. Older staff members tell them the story, though the details have softened over time, the sharp edges worn smooth by repetition. In Dawsonville, on Main Street, where the Dairy Queen once stood and where teenagers gathered on summer nights in 1990, there's a different kind of business now. But people still remember what the town felt like that summer when Jennifer disappeared. The fear that settled over the community. The realization that something terrible could happen even here, even in a place where everyone knew everyone. That realization never fully left. Carol Winters, now fully retired, occasionally gives talks at law enforcement conferences about cold cases and persistence. She always mentions Jennifer. She talks about the importance of never assuming a case is unsolvable just because years have passed. She talks about the fingerprint that sat in an evidence locker for 18 years before technology caught up. She talks about the witnesses who came forward decades later, driven by guilt or conscience or simply the passage of time. She tells other detectives, someone always knows something. Your job is to wait for them to be ready to tell you. When people ask Winters if she thinks Torrance will ever reveal where Jennifer's body is, she says she doesn't know. She's tried. She's visited him in prison twice, sitting across from him in the visitation room, asking him directly to give Jennifer's family closure. Both times, he refused to speak to her. "I have nothing to say to you," he told her during the second visit. "I've said everything I'm going to say." Winters believes he's protecting himself, holding on to the one piece of power he has left. As long as no one knows where Jennifer is, he has something they want. It's cruel, but she's seen it before in other cases. Some people would rather take their secrets to the grave than offer one final act of kindness. The question that haunts everyone who worked Jennifer's case is simple: why? Why did Michael Torrance follow Jennifer that night? What happened in those hours between when she left the hospital and when her car appeared at Amicalola Falls? The prosecution's theory, laid out during trial, was that Torrance had become infatuated with Jennifer. Multiple witnesses confirmed he'd been seen at the hospital more frequently in the months before she disappeared, though he had no official reason to be there. He'd asked about her, made comments about her to other staff members. He'd been told she wasn't interested. The theory suggested that on the night of July 20, 1990, Torrance had been waiting for her. He'd followed her as she left the hospital, possibly intending only to talk to her, to convince her to give him a chance. But something had gone wrong. Maybe she'd rejected him more forcefully than before. Maybe the confrontation had escalated in a way he hadn't anticipated. What happened after that was speculation, but the evidence suggested violence. Jennifer would never have abandoned her car willingly. She would never have walked away from her life, from her mother, from the job she loved. Torrance had been trained in law enforcement. He knew how to control a situation. He knew the area, knew where someone could disappear without being found. The prosecution believed Jennifer had been killed that night, likely within hours of leaving the hospital. They believed Torrance had hidden her body somewhere in the vast wilderness around Dawson County, an area of dense forests, deep ravines, and hidden caves where someone could stay lost forever. But belief isn't the same as proof, and without Jennifer's body, without a confession, the full truth died with whatever happened that night. In 2018, a group of retired law enforcement officers formed a volunteer organization dedicated to searching for missing persons in Georgia. They focus on cold cases where the victim is presumed dead but never found. Jennifer Clarkson's case is on their list. They've conducted 3 major searches since the organization formed, using cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and drone technology that didn't exist in 1990. They've covered hundreds of acres around Amicalola Falls and the surrounding state parks. So far, they've found nothing. The volunteer coordinator, a former GBI agent named Robert Chen, says they're not giving up. Statistically, most bodies hidden in wilderness areas are eventually found, he explains. It might take 5 years, it might take 50, but the earth gives up its secrets eventually. Someone will be hiking, or hunting, or clearing land for development, and they'll find something. When that happens, we want to be ready to respond immediately. Until then, Jennifer remains missing. Her case is solved in the legal sense, justice served in the form of Michael Torrance's conviction and life sentence. But for those who loved her, for those who worked tirelessly to find answers, the case won't truly be closed until she comes home. There are moments, in the years since the trial, when people in Dawsonville still stop and think about Jennifer. It happens when someone drives past the old hospital building, now converted into medical offices but still recognizable. It happens when the local news reports another missing person case. It happens on July 20th each year, the anniversary of the night she disappeared. Some people leave flowers at a small memorial that was erected in Jennifer's honor at the Dawsonville City Park. It's a simple, stone bench with a plaque bearing her name and dates. The inscription reads, "Forever remembered, forever missed." The bench sits beneath a dogwood tree, overlooking a small pond where ducks gather and children play. It's peaceful there. Jennifer would have liked it. Her story has become part of the town's history, a reminder of a dark chapter that everyone would prefer to forget but knows they shouldn't. It's a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it wears a uniform and a smile. Sometimes it lives next door, works alongside you, sits in the pew behind you at church. The lesson Dawsonville learned was hard and costly. It cost Jennifer her life. It cost Margaret Clarkson decades of anguish and uncertainty. It cost Susan Torrance her marriage and her place in a community she'd called home for 38 years. It cost the town its innocence, that comfortable assumption that bad things happen elsewhere, to other people. But the lesson also revealed something important about human resilience and the pursuit of justice. Dennis Pritchard, the maintenance worker who ran away in fear, eventually found the courage to speak. It took him 17 years, but he came forward. His testimony was critical to the case. Susan Torrance, the loyal wife who'd kept silent for 2 decades, finally chose truth over loyalty. Her statement broke the case open in ways nothing else could have. Carol Winters, the detective who inherited a cold case that most people had forgotten, refused to let it go. She worked it for years, pursuing every thread, refusing to accept that Jennifer would remain a mystery forever. These weren't extraordinary people. They were ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and eventually chose to do the right thing, even when the right thing was terrifying or painful or came too late to save anyone. In 2019, a journalist from Atlanta wrote a long-form article about Jennifer's case for a regional magazine. The piece focused on the 23-year gap between her disappearance and Torrance's arrest, exploring how cases can remain dormant for decades before suddenly breaking open. The article included interviews with several people who'd known Jennifer. They described her as someone who lit up a room, who remembered the names of patients' grandchildren, who worked double shifts without complaint when the hospital was short-staffed. One former co-worker said something that stuck with readers: Jennifer was the kind of person who made you feel like you mattered. She'd ask how you were doing, and she actually wanted to know. She'd remember what you told her and ask about it the next time she saw you. The world lost something valuable when she was taken from it. That sentiment echoed through the article, through the community, through everyone who'd been touched by Jennifer's story. The world had lost something valuable. Not just in the abstract sense that all murder victims are valuable, but in the specific, particular sense that Jennifer Clarkson had been someone who made her corner of the world better by being in it. Her death didn't just end a life. It removed a presence, a kindness, a light that people had relied on without fully realizing it until it was gone. Michael Torrance, by taking Jennifer's life, didn't just commit an act of violence against one woman. He committed an act of violence against everyone who knew her, everyone who loved her, everyone who would have been touched by her kindness in the decades she never got to live. That's the mathematics of murder that's often overlooked. One death creates infinite ripples. Margaret Clarkson spent 23 years waiting for answers. She died 3 years after getting them, having spent those final years in a state of bittersweet peace. She'd gotten justice, but not her daughter. She'd gotten a conviction, but not a body to bury. It was better than nothing. It was far from everything. In her final interview, given to a local newspaper a few months before she died, Margaret said something that stayed with the reporter. "I'm grateful someone is being held accountable," she said. "But what I wouldn't give for just one more conversation with my daughter. One more phone call. One more Saturday lunch. Justice can't give me that. Nothing can." That's the truth at the heart of every solved case. Justice is important. Accountability matters. But it doesn't undo what was done. It doesn't bring back what was lost. It only ensures that someone pays a price for having taken it. For 23 years, Michael Torrance lived as a free man. He retired with a pension. He celebrated holidays with his family. He slept in his own bed. He walked through Dawsonville knowing he'd taken Jennifer's life and hidden her body somewhere no one could find it, and he did nothing to make it right. That he eventually faced consequences was not inevitable. It required people who refused to forget, who kept pushing, who sacrificed comfort and certainty for the possibility of truth. There's a conversation that happens sometimes in Dawsonville, usually late at night, usually between people who've lived there long enough to remember 1990. The conversation is about guilt and complicity, about how many people might have suspected something over the years but said nothing. People remember moments now that seemed insignificant at the time but feel heavier in hindsight. The way Torrance would change the subject whenever Jennifer's case came up at the sheriff's office. The way he took vacation time during the major searches, absenting himself when everyone else was volunteering to help look for her. The way he discouraged other deputies from spending too much time on the case, suggesting it was hopeless, that she'd probably run away or been killed by a drifter passing through town. Were those signs? Or are they only signs now, viewed through the lens of what's known? It's the question that haunts everyone. Could Jennifer have been found sooner if someone had paid closer attention? If someone had asked harder questions? If the department had been willing to consider that one of their own might be involved? The answer is probably yes, but it's an answer that comes with its own kind of pain. Accepting that Jennifer might have gotten justice sooner means accepting that people failed her. Not just Torrance, but everyone who let the case go cold, who stopped asking questions, who accepted the convenient explanation that she'd simply vanished without a trace. Carol Winters addressed this in one of her conference talks. A detective from another jurisdiction asked her if she thought the original investigation had been compromised by Torrance's presence in the department. "I think the original investigation was thorough given the tools they had," Winters said carefully. "But yes, I think having the perpetrator working among the investigators created a situation where certain questions didn't get asked. Torrance could steer conversations, could volunteer for assignments that let him control information flow, could suggest theories that pointed away from himself. It's not that the detectives were incompetent. It's that they trusted someone they shouldn't have. Trust is the thread that runs through every part of Jennifer's story. Jennifer trusted that the parking lot was safe. Dennis Pritchard didn't trust that the sheriff's office would believe him over a deputy. Susan Torrance trusted her husband when he told her not to ask questions. The community trusted that a 15-year veteran of law enforcement couldn't be capable of murder. All of that trust was misplaced, and the cost was catastrophic. But there was also trust that proved valid. Margaret Clarkson trusted that someone, eventually, would care enough to keep looking. Carol Winters trusted her instincts when something about Torrance's denials didn't ring true. Dennis Pritchard eventually trusted that telling the truth was more important than protecting himself. Susan Torrance trusted that speaking out was the right thing to do, even if it destroyed her marriage and her reputation. That kind of trust, the kind that pushes people toward difficult truths rather than comfortable lies, is what finally broke the case open. In 2021, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation released a statement about advances in forensic genealogy, the technique that had been used to solve several high-profile cold cases in other states. The statement mentioned that several Georgia cases were being reviewed to determine if genetic evidence could be re-examined using these new techniques. Jennifer Clarkson's case was not on the list, because there was no genetic evidence to re-examine. No DNA samples had ever been recovered because her body was never found. The case had been solved through old-fashioned detective work, witness testimony, and the slow accumulation of circumstantial evidence that eventually became impossible to ignore. In some ways, that makes Jennifer's case more remarkable. It was solved not by scientific breakthrough but by human courage and persistence. By people choosing, finally, to speak. There's a small group on social media now, dedicated to missing persons cases in Georgia. Jennifer's case gets mentioned occasionally, usually by someone asking if there's been any progress in locating her remains. The answer is always the same. No, not yet. But people are still looking. The volunteer search organization continues to work on it. They've expanded their search area based on geographic profiling and analysis of where someone with Torrance's knowledge of the area might have hidden a body. They've partnered with academic programs that use cold case investigations as training opportunities for students studying forensic science and criminal justice. Every year, new searchers join the effort. People who never knew Jennifer but feel compelled to help bring her home. People who understand that she deserves a proper burial, that her family deserve that closure, that even though Margaret is gone, there are still people who care. One of the volunteer searchers, a retired teacher named Patricia Simmons, explained why she devotes her weekends to walking through the woods looking for a woman who disappeared before Patricia moved to Georgia. Someone has to care, Patricia said simply. Someone has to refuse to let her be forgotten. If that's me, if that's us, then that's what we'll do. For as long as it takes. That sentiment, that refusal to forget, is perhaps the most powerful legacy of Jennifer's case. She mattered. She still matters. Not because her death was particularly brutal or because her case generated national headlines, but because she was a human being who deserved to live and whose absence left a hole in the world that's never been filled. Michael Torrance took her life in 1990. He tried to erase her by hiding her body, by lying for 23 years, by creating a wall of silence and denial that seemed impenetrable. But he failed. Jennifer hasn't been erased. She's remembered. Her case is solved. Her killer is in prison. And somewhere in the forests and hills of Dawson County, she's still waiting to be found by people who haven't given up looking. The impact of Jennifer's case extends beyond Dawsonville, beyond Dawson County, beyond even Georgia. It's become a teaching case in criminal justice programs, an example of how cold cases can break open decades after going dormant. It's studied by advocates working to improve how law enforcement agencies handle missing persons investigations. It's cited in discussions about accountability within police departments. But more than any of that, it's a story that resonates with anyone who's ever waited for answers that seemed like they'd never come. In 2022, a podcast dedicated to solved cold cases featured Jennifer's story. The episode was titled "The 23-Year Silence." It attracted hundreds of thousands of listeners, many of whom reached out to say they'd been moved by Jennifer's story, by Margaret's perseverance, by the eventual, hard-won justice. Several listeners said the episode had inspired them to come forward with information about their own cold cases. One woman contacted police about something she'd witnessed 20 years earlier and had been too afraid to report. Her testimony helped solve a different missing persons case in a different state. That's another kind of ripple effect. Jennifer's story, told honestly and thoroughly, gave someone else the courage to speak. That voice helped bring another family closure. The connection spread outward, invisible threads linking cases and people across time and distance. During the podcast episode, Carol Winters was interviewed. Near the end of the conversation, the host asked her what she wanted people to remember about Jennifer's case. Winters thought for a moment. "I want people to remember that Jennifer was a real person, not just a victim. She had a life, a family, dreams. She showed up for work every day and took care of people. She was kind. That's what was taken from the world when she was killed." Then she added, "And I want people to remember that it's never too late for the truth to come out." Dennis Pritchard waited 17 years to speak, but when he did, it mattered. Susan Torrance waited 20, but her testimony was crucial. If you know something about a case, even if it happened decades ago, it's not too late to come forward. You might be the person who finally brings someone home. That message has been heard. In the years since Jennifer's case was solved, the Dawson County Sheriff's Office has received renewed tips on several other cold cases. None have broken open yet, but Winters believes it's only a matter of time. Jennifer's case showed people that these investigations don't just disappear, she said. We don't forget. We keep the files. We keep looking. And when someone's ready to talk, we're ready to listen. In Dawsonville today, life continues in the way it always has. The town has grown some, new developments on the outskirts, new businesses along the highway. But the core of it remains unchanged, still a place where people know their neighbors, where community matters, where the past isn't easily forgotten. The hospital where Jennifer worked is still operating, still serving the same families. The roads she drove are the same roads people drive today. The landscape hasn't changed much. The mountains, the forests, the rivers, all still there, still beautiful, still concealing whatever they've concealed for 33 years. But the people have changed. The people who remember that summer in 1990 carry it differently now. They carry it with the knowledge that justice, however delayed, did arrive. That the man responsible didn't get away with it. That Jennifer's life mattered enough for people to keep fighting for answers long after most people had moved on. That matters more than some people might think. There's a weight that comes with unsolved cases, a heaviness that settles over communities when someone vanishes without explanation. It creates fear, paranoia, the sense that danger is always lurking just beyond sight. When cases are solved, even decades later, that weight lifts slightly. Not entirely, because the grief and loss remain. But the uncertainty ends. The not knowing, which might be the worst part of all, finally comes to a close. Margaret Clarkson lived long enough to feel that weight lift. She lived long enough to know that her daughter hadn't just vanished into nothing, that someone was being held accountable, that the truth had finally emerged. In her final months, Margaret told friends she felt like she could rest now. She'd fought the fight she needed to fight. She'd seen it through to something resembling an ending, even if it wasn't the ending she'd hoped for. When she died in 2016, her funeral was held at the same church where Jennifer's memorial service had been held 26 years earlier. Many of the same people attended. They were older now, grayer, more tired. But they came to pay their respects to a woman who'd embodied determination and grace under the kind of pressure that breaks most people. Carol Winters spoke at the funeral. She talked about Margaret's strength, her refusal to let Jennifer be forgotten, her partnership with law enforcement even when progress seemed impossible. Margaret Clarkson taught me what real persistence looks like, Winters said. She showed me that a mother's love doesn't diminish with time, doesn't fade when answers don't come quickly. She called me every few months for years, always polite, always hopeful, always believing we'd find the truth eventually. And we did. We found it because she never let us forget that Jennifer was out there somewhere, waiting for us to bring her home. The service ended with a song Jennifer had loved, something soft and hopeful. People filed out quietly, many stopping to hug Margaret's remaining family members, to share memories, to promise they wouldn't forget. And they haven't. If you stayed with this story until the end, if you listened to every word of Jennifer's journey from disappearance to justice, you understand something important. You understand that these cases matter. That the people in them aren't just names or headlines, they're daughters and mothers and friends who deserved better than what they got. If you believe Jennifer Clarkson deserved someone to keep fighting for her even after 23 years of silence, hit subscribe. Because that's exactly what this channel does. We tell the stories of people who've been waiting too long for their truth to be heard. We refuse to let them be forgotten. This channel brings you true crime stories from small American towns, cases that reveal both the worst of human nature and the resilience that refuses to let evil have the final word. Every story here is chosen because it matters, because someone, somewhere, is still waiting for answers or has finally received them after years of fighting. Jennifer's story is one of patience and persistence, of truth that took more than 2 decades to surface but eventually did because people refused to stop looking. It's a story about a maintenance worker who found his courage, a wife who chose truth over loyalty, a detective who wouldn't let go, and a mother who believed, against all odds, that justice would eventually arrive. And it did. Not perfectly. Not completely. Jennifer is still missing, still somewhere in the Georgia wilderness, still waiting to be found. But the man who took her life is behind bars, convicted and sentenced, his denials ultimately meaningless against the weight of evidence that accumulated over years of determined investigation. That's not nothing. That's the difference between silence and accountability. Between a case that haunts a community forever and a case that, while still painful, at least has an answer. These are the stories that need to be told. Not because they're sensational, but because they're real. Because behind every solved cold case is a group of people who refuse to accept that some questions will never be answered. Jennifer Lynn Clarkson was born on March 15, 1960. She grew up in Dawsonville, graduated from Dawson County High School, married young and divorced a few years later, worked at the local hospital taking care of people who needed her. She was 30 years old when her life was stolen from her on a July night in 1990. She was someone's daughter. Someone's friend. Someone's coworker. Someone who mattered. 23 years later, justice found the man who took her life. It found him because people who'd been silent finally spoke. Because a detective refused to close a file that everyone else had forgotten. Because truth has a way of surfacing, even when it's buried deep. The search for Jennifer continues. Volunteers still walk through the forests around Dawson County, still use technology and determination to try to bring her home. Maybe this year someone will find something. Maybe it will take another decade. Maybe it will be a hiker or a hunter or someone clearing land who stumbles across what's been hidden for so long. Whenever it happens, if it happens, there will be people ready to respond. Ready to treat Jennifer's remains with the dignity and care she deserved in life. Ready to finally give her family the closure of a proper burial. Until then, her case stands as a reminder that justice delayed is not always justice denied. That patience and persistence can break through decades of silence. That the truth matters, even when it comes too late to save anyone. Rest in peace, Jennifer. You haven't been forgotten. You never will be. And to everyone who works on cold cases, everyone who refuses to let the missing stay lost, everyone who believes that accountability matters no matter how much time has passed, thank you. Your work changes lives. It brings families closure. It proves that time doesn't erase truth, it only tests who's willing to keep looking for it. These stories matter because people like Jennifer matter. Because small towns like Dawsonville matter. Because justice, even when it takes 23 years to arrive, still matters. If you believe that too, you're already part of why this channel exists. You're the reason these stories get told. You're the people who understand that true crime isn't entertainment, it's remembrance. It's honoring lives that were cut short and celebrating the people who fought to make sure those lives weren't forgotten. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about a woman named Jennifer who disappeared from a hospital parking lot on a summer night in 1990 and whose story finally got told the way it deserved to be told. Now if you haven't, please subscribe, like and share to a friend who'd love a story like this. I'll see you in the next one.